Hey, everybody. Welcome to Locked On Lakers for Tuesday. Brian Kamenetsky, Andy Kamenetsky. The Rajon Rondo deal is finalized. He's on his way to Cleveland, and the Lakers figured out a way to save themselves about $4 million in the process. But they have other housekeeping issues to figure out, including whether to extend Avery Bradley's contract through the end of the season and whether to bring Stanley Johnson back and when. We'll talk about all that. Plus, good news around Malik Monk coming up on today's episode of Locked On Lakers.
You are Locked On Lakers, your daily Los Angeles Lakers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I want to thank everybody for making Locked On Lakers your first listen of every day, Monday through Friday, wherever you get your podcasts. Andy and I have this thing up for you early. The dead hours of the night. So it's always available for you whenever you need it. Make another Locked On podcast your second listen of every day after making us your first. So we'll get to Malik Monk, Andy, who was the topic of conversation really at Lakers practice on Monday. Really openly kind of talked about, this process and what he's been going through this year in ways that I thought were pretty interesting. Also, the ways he was influenced by none other than Nick Young.
Yes.
Of today's children, Nick Young. That was pretty cool.
Just like the Wu-Tang Clan, Nick Young is for the children.
Exactly. And we'll also try to get to some stuff Frank Vogel said about continuity and the rotation and some of the challenges around that the Lakers are facing. But first, Andy, let's talk about some housekeeping because the Lakers are doing a lot of stuff right now. We're not even at the trade deadline. The Rajon Rondo deal was finalized on Monday, made official. He is sent to Cleveland. Denzel Valentine, as expected, was part of that trade. But as it turns out, they routed Valentine to New York, and the Lakers received the draft rights to someone named Louis something or other. It doesn't matter.
No, it really does not matter. It's better to just not butcher his last name when ultimately he is not going to play any role with the Lakers whatsoever.
With the Lakers or anyone other than perhaps one day being traded again,
right?
in a rights deal like this.
He is an accounting footnote at this point.
Yes, he was a 2014 second round pick of the Pacers who's been traded twice for reasons like this. What I always think is fascinating about stuff like this is not the name of the player who is never going to play in the NBA, but that this is an example of GMs kind of all scratching each other's backs to save the Lakers a little bit of money. And if Valentine had come to LA and then been waived, the Lakers would have had to pay a certain amount of money of his salary, and that would apply to their luxury tax and all that stuff. If they've saved $4 million by doing this, there's always the possibility to me, Andy, that this could give them at least a little bit of wiggle room down the road if they need to bring in a little bit more money or do something that could cost them a little bit extra. And so while it doesn't sound like a big deal, it is kind of a good bit of management to be able to do this in a way that doesn't cost them any money.
Yeah,
saves them money, really.
They could have figured out how to trade Denzel Valentine before the season and move this Louis character around. Maybe they could have re-signed Alex Caruso.
It's possible. Like that's all.
They just figured out a way to do this in the summer.
Can you imagine if that was the one thing that they just couldn't accomplish? Like all of the dominoes depended on that.
I mean, really, the best way to have just avoided it is don't sign Rajon Rondo to begin with. Like if that was really the biggest issue, but right. I digress. Ultimately,
I would love to see them. I would love to see them red paperclip this Louis fellow into like some sort of really impactful play.
I mean, look, every single dollar ultimately counts for every organization, some more so than the others. And as much as I think Laker fans have this perception that everything is getting nickel and dimed because the Buss family is relative to other owners, not all that rich. I mean, they are exceptionally rich compared to normal people and even compared to rich people. But compared to NBA rich owners, they are on the much lower end of that totem pole. But at the same, At the same time, though, all these organizations care about the bottom line. I say all the time, show me the owner that truly does not care about his bottom line over time, and that will be the first ever. I firmly believe there is no such thing as that owner, period.
Yeah.
But, at the same time, I do believe that Jeannie Buss and the Buss family do want to be competitive, even with keeping, in mind these financial considerations that have obviously dictated decisions. So you save a few $1,000,000 here or there, maybe it feels a little less painful to spend into that down the road. I think
if you don't have to spend $4 million to waive Denzel Valentine, it makes a lot of sense. And so, when you start to, that's one thing. And I do think it was interesting. Frank Vogel talked about how it was a conscious thing that for the Lakers to be able to move Rondo. We mentioned this on Monday's show, but it was certainly confirmed today. Little stuff like that, where you can take a guy who you would otherwise perhaps release and instead send him somewhere where he can play a valuable role, where you're not sending him, into the wilderness to a team that's just going to release him or whatever it might be. Rondo goes somewhere where he has a home, he can finish out the season and make whatever free agent and career decisions he wants, playing meaningful basketball and contributing in a very similar way as he has on other teams, as a veteran mentor, as a guy who plays, when needed and stuff. And little things like that are important for organizations to do, to show that they take care of players. The Lakers aren't always great at that, but did it in this particular case. And it's important to do it as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, Frank Vogel said during Monday's practice that Rajon Rondo, and I thought this was interesting just because Rondo has had a very interesting career when it comes to relationships with coaches and relationships with organizations. Let's just say they've been on both sides of the spectrum, depending on where you are talking about. And Rondo has had some pretty messy exits from teams. He said that Rondo is, one of his favorite players he's ever coached, and that he plans on staying in touch with him, and that he described him as somebody that will always be not just a special player to him, but a special friend. Like he was genuinely, I don't, emotional might be too strong of a way of putting it. Like he wasn't openly weeping or anything like that, but but it sounded like, this was a coach who is genuinely going to miss his player.
Yeah. So, it does make him also eligible for grandparents and special friends day at school, which I always thought, if you don't have any grandparents, he could bring Rajon Rondo with him. So a couple other things that are going on. Stanley Johnson, you never remember the name of the holiday when you bring your grandparents to school is grandparents and special friends day, in case you don't have any grandparents. It's like, there. What is the line from The Simpsons? You're old and old people die. I mean, it happens. So, Stanley Johnson
nodding.
Yeah, that's fine. Stanley, we can fix it in post.
I'm just letting you babble.
Stanley Johnson,
like an old person who perhaps has no special friends.
I'm caught here because it's like, do I explain myself or do I just keep going?
Sometimes the better course of action is just not say it.
But no, it's out there already.
Yeah.
Once you're like, can't undo it, can't unring the bell.
It's the Lloyd Dobler nervous talking thing.
You figure I'd be past it by now. So Stanley Johnson and Nick Collison, before we get to Avery Bradley, who's the bigger piece of decision making that the Lakers have to do. Stanley Johnson and Nick Collison were both not at practice on Monday. Both of their 10-day hardship contracts have expired. The expectation is still that the roster spot that the Lakers opened up by trading Rondo is going to go to Stanley Johnson. They can sign him at any time to a deal through the rest of the year. If the Lakers wanted to give him a second 10-day, they couldn't do that until the 5th. Because that's when you can start giving out 10-day contracts, like real ones, not hardship ones. And the Lakers don't have any hardship slots. Are you at all concerned that the Lakers are somehow not going to bring back Stanley Johnson, who has quickly become a valuable member of the roster?
I would be pretty shocked. I mean, never say never. And you never know if Stanley Johnson could get offered the exact same contract from another team with the idea of having a bigger role than he has on the Lakers, although that in and of itself would be pretty surprising to me. Like, I think
Mhm.
it is hard to imagine. He's played well on this 10-day deal. It would be hard for me to imagine that Stanley Johnson, who is at least a known commodity in this league, would have somehow impressed a team into a larger role than the one I anticipate he has for the Lakers. So again, never say never, but I would find it very surprising, A, if Stanley Johnson is not on the team for the rest of the season, or B, if the Lakers somehow try to get too cute by half with this thing. I don't know, by like offering him, say, a second 10-day deal, then the big boy deal, because they're trying to save a few bucks. Again, never say never. I would find that very surprising and frankly, like borderline malpractice, given
Yeah,
that they need Stanley Johnson.
right. I think this is pretty obviously, when you think of the way this is playing out, and then the sort of the way that Frank Vogel talked about him, and we've got a lot of stuff going on. I feel like this is one of those deals that they've worked this out with Stanley Johnson's agent. Collison, on the other hand, I do not think will be back.
No, I don't. To be perfectly honest, I mean, mechanics of whether or not you could open up the spot, whether you'd be willing to eat, say, DeAndre Jordan's money, for to do something like that. I don't think he's played well enough.
Sounds like a game show. Eat DeAndre Jordan's money.
It's a lot of money.
You're next on Eat DeAndre Jordan's Money.
What is that? What is that?
I don't know, but it's a great game show title.
Okay, this is what it is. You get to keep the equivalent amount of money that you eat, but the denominations of money become more difficult to eat the higher the denomination is. Like, like $100 bill. I don't know, there's like shards of glass on it or something like that. I made you spit take. Nice. Very happy with that, Brian.
Yeah, that's good.
I legit made you spit take.
That was really good. I like that.
Like a $1 bill, it's maybe scented in something that tastes nice, but you get to 100 or like
$1 bills are made out of Cadbury bars.
Yeah, like $1,000 bill. It's rocks and glass, like something really unpleasant. But that's Eat DeAndre Jordan's money.
Yeah. So that is a gig that I think we're both aiming for now that we've invented it. And
that's actually
he's got plenty
fascinating
of
game show.
Literally, to eat money, to just eat money, and you get to keep how much money you eat.
That feels like sort of an offshoot of Squid Game.
I was thinking exactly the same thing. Like, this is something they do on Squid Game. Like, you eat the money and you get to keep it, and it's deeply humiliating.
Yeah, the only reason it's not on Squid Game is thankfully that was never a children's game.
Like, do you know how you eat an elephant, Andy? One bite at a time. It's the same thing with $150,000. How do you eat $150,000 of DeAndre Jordan's money? One bite at a time. Anyway, we should move on, or at the very least break and come right back to this, which is possible. So we do the most important bit of housekeeping, though, really is about Avery Bradley. So we want to talk about that. We'll get to Malik Monk as well next.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by Truebill. Do you know why free trials renew without your consent? It's a business scam out to get you. Don't let greedy corporations pocket your money. Download Truebill to take control of your subscriptions. Truebill is the new app that helps you identify and stop paying for subscriptions you don't want, need, or just forgot about. On average, people save up to $720 a year with Truebill. Companies intentionally make subscriptions hard to cancel, but Truebill makes it incredibly simple. Just link your accounts and Truebill will cancel your unwanted subscriptions in one tap. Truebill has over 2 million users and has helped them save collectively over $100 million. So don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today at Truebill.com/LockedOnNBA. Go right now, Truebill.com/LockedOnNBA. It could save you thousands a year. Truebill.com/LockedOnNBA.
The Lakers have to decide by Friday, Andy, whether or not they're going to guarantee Avery Bradley's contract through the end of the season. There was a period earlier in the year where I think the answer wasn't so clear, despite Frank Vogel's devotion to Avery. And that, but I think at this point, I, for one, would be very surprised if he is not here the entire season.
Yeah. He has played legitimately well and better the more the season has gone along in December and as far into January as we are, he has shot the three extremely well. He is somebody, we've talked about this a lot, who absolutely embodies what Frank Vogel wants in terms of a defensive mindset, but I think also as just a team chemistry and sort of team ethos. He is very much a Frank Vogel kind of guy, and that's been evident since the first season that Frank Vogel coached this team. And Avery Bradley went from a guy that was being discussed as part of an open competition for starting point guard to, 5 minutes into training camp, he's the starter.
Yes,
you can just
absolutely.
tell by the way Vogel talked about him. And look, you and I had been critical earlier in the year of the way Frank Vogel was using Bradley as much as we did. We didn't even think, frankly, he should have been in the rotation.
I was going to say, in the sense that he was using him.
Yeah, but you know what? I mean, kudos to Frank Vogel, or mea culpa, however you want to put it. But he has thus far been proven correct about this one, and Bradley deserves the spot.
If you want to break it down over their last 15 games, Laker games, of which Bradley has not played in all of them, but you get the point. He has the highest net rating of any player on the team, playing real minutes. It's not like, it's one of those, his net rating is 133, but he's only played 4 minutes. And so he has earned his, I don't know who they're going to get that's better. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Like, they have decisions to make about the rotation. And when Kendrick Nunn comes back, it's going to squeeze guys. It could squeeze Nunn. It could squeeze Bradley. It's going to squeeze THT. When Anthony Davis comes back, it's going to, bump everyone kind of up a slot in terms of where they're playing, even with these small lineups. And that's going to squeeze people. But it's hard to determine where they would find somebody if Bradley continues to play somewhere close to what he's been doing, replacing a coach or replacing a player. Even if they're a guy that's underperforming, you still have to say who's out there that's better, who's going to help us more. That doesn't mean that by the end of the season, Bradley has to play 28 minutes a game, but it means that you might want to have him on your roster. And I don't have a problem. He's earned that spot.
Yeah, and look, it's a great story. He's somebody that was cut by the Warriors in training camp. He's somebody that over the latter part of his career has bounced around a lot, including, his first stint with the Lakers. And it's interesting. Avery Bradley is somebody that, basketball media, basketball Twitter, and I would say basketball wonks in general, he is a very polarizing player. He's somebody with a reputation as if not a defensive specialist, an above average defender that a lot of people cite numbers as saying it's misleading. If you hear players talk about Avery Bradley, like reportedly, Draymond Green and Steph Curry really wanted the Warriors to keep Bradley. I believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, and I apologize if I'm not, but it was kind of a decision between Avery Bradley and Gary Payton II. And obviously Gary Payton II has been phenomenal for the Warriors. So it would be hard to say that that Golden State's brass messed that one up. But my point in bringing this up is just players around the league, I think, really respect the way Avery Bradley plays. They consider him, if nothing else, a pain in the ass to go up against if he's defending you. He will make it unpleasant. I think that's some of it, and something that players and his peers respect is just they see the hustle that he puts into it, and they don't consider it particularly easy to go up against him. They consider it a chore,
whatever
even if
it is.
Even if the numbers don't back it. These are the guys out on the court. They know what's going on.
I think there's a level of professionalism that they respect. I think they respect the effort. I think they respect the idea of a guy who is trying to squeeze out every ounce of talent that he has. But I also think too, it's like some of the advanced numbers aside, and I don't think they're meaningless. Bradley, though, one of the things we were going to talk about, I don't know if we'll have a lot of time to dive into it today, was I asked Vogel about continuity and how much time they have to experiment and, lineup combinations and all this stuff. Like, ideally, these are things that you want to be done with 50 or 60 games into the season. So you go into the playoffs with some real, really drilling into the finer points of lineup combinations that you've come down on. Bradley, they're not going to be able to do that. Vogel said they're going to be working this stuff all the way up to the end of the season. Bradley is a guy who makes Vogel's job easier because he knows exactly what he's going to do, good and bad. He knows exactly what he's going to do, and his skill set
Vogel knows what
offensively,
Bradley's going to do.
correct. His skill set fits well when he's shooting well. Bradley's skill set fits with what the Lakers need. A guy who can be a credible outside shooter, but also moves extremely well without the ball, who is a smart cutter. He's done a very low usage player, all that kind of stuff around LeBron and all that. Intelligent, done it. Predictability is even more important for the Lakers right now, which is actually one of the reasons when we get to THT at some point over the course of the week, I actually think he's in a little bit of trouble when the rotation comes, because I actually think he's one of the least predictable players that they have in terms of, like, compare him to Austin Reeves, for example, who I think the coaches know exactly what you're going to get from him, and it's very good. It's an interesting spot that the Lakers are in, that, and I think, Dave McMenamin of ESPN asked some questions about this following Monday's game. Stanley Johnson, Austin Reeves, Avery Bradley. 3 guys that, you certainly wouldn't expect or necessarily want to be important players on this team have become very important players on this team.
Yeah, at this point, if Avery Bradley isn't kept for the rest of the season, we've talked a lot about how Frank Vogel's future with the team feels uncertain. He only got the 1-year extension, but despite being just a couple seasons removed from a championship, Frank Vogel loves Avery Bradley, like absolutely loves the guy.
Yep.
If they're not bringing back Avery Bradley, it feels like them saying to Frank Vogel, "Yeah, you ain't around long for this ride."
Yeah, that
like
that
we
1
won't
year
even
thing.
we won't even do the little things to make you happy.
The only reason we
That's
gave
what
you
it
a
feels
1-year
like.
deal, the only reason we gave you a 1-year extension is because we couldn't give you a 6-month extension.
Right. I hope you've enjoyed your time with Avery Bradley, because we're taking him away from you.
Oh God, that would be mean. All right, let's talk about one of the happier stories for the Lakers this season. Malik Monk, who was the topic of conversation on Monday after practice and revealed something Andy and I thought was awesome. We'll do that next. So, Andy, you may remember a few years ago when Nick Young set the internet on fire by revealing that his now tatted right arm, but at the time was completely blank. And Nick Young is basically covered in ink from head to toe, other than his right arm, for a long time. And the reason was that right arm was
strictly for buckets.
No ink, just for buckets. So McMenamin, who we just mentioned before, is an excellent reporter and should win a Pulitzer for this, noticed at Monday's game that Malik Monk has tons of ink on his left arm and virtually none on his right. And so, shot in the dark, you only really get one question at these press conferences right now. Ask Malik Monk about it. And before he even finished the question, Andy, Monk yelled out, "Strictly buckets." Knew exactly where Dave was going, and I swear to God, I realized, I'm not even talking about the best story of 2022. It's been 4 days, 5 days, or whatever. This is one of my favorite moments of the last year and a half. The happiness on Monk's face when he got to talk about this was fantastic. It reminded me of Nick Young's great influence on today's youth, but it also was a reminder to me of Malik Monk, regardless of what you think about as a player, just seems like a really genuinely good dude.
Yeah, he does. He's always very, very friendly when he's deals with us after practices or after games. It's funny, actually, this whole thing with Nick Young and that influence on Malik Monk, who Monk said, it doesn't sound like, I'm not even sure he's ever met Nick Young.
No, it's not. He said it's never anything he's ever talked to him about.
Right. Malik Monk was in high school when Nick Young was still in the league.
17.
It is a reminder, by the way, that Nick Young is a much better influence on your young players from a distance than actually in the locker room, because as we witnessed when Nick Young was a mentor to Jordan Clarkson and D'Angelo Russell and some of the other young guys that we were in the locker room, we covered those teams and we were around them. And full disclosure, we love Nick.
Nick's a great guy. He really is. And he's a genuinely good dude.
And he was an absolute pleasure to cover. He made those seasons tolerable because they were so unpleasant, but he was hilarious. He was fun, all of that. Nick Young was not necessarily a great influence on those young guys. So again, it's great to see Nick Young influence your young players. You just want it from maybe 7 or 9 states removed, something like that.
So the more important stuff with Monk, though, who has, I mentioned Avery Bradley leading the team in net rating over the last 15 games. Monk is third behind Austin Reeves, and has really settled into what I think is probably going to be a starting spot for the rest of the year. Works well, with LeBron. Again, is that spot up shooter. His 3-point shooting has been certainly good enough overall. We're up around over 37%, but a little bit better of late. But finishes at the basket very smoothly, an effective passer as long as he's not sort of overdoing it. And especially when Davis comes back, they'll be able to protect him a little bit more in a lot of their defensive lineups. He has certainly earned that spot over, say, Wayne Ellington, who was another guy who could fill that role. I asked him about this because we've mentioned a few times he made a massive bet on himself that he would come here, a place where his playing time was not guaranteed, and be able to play himself into a position where he would get paid by someone like a real contract. And it was funny, like he noted that there weren't a lot of people necessarily offering him a ton of stuff, but he absolutely could have found a place to do a 1-year deal where his role was going to be far more guaranteed than what he had in LA. And this bet that he's making on himself is absolutely paying off.
Yeah, Frank Vogel, in talking about Malik, because there were a lot of questions about him during Monday's practice, said that there was no role guaranteed to Malik. So he was really making this gamble without a net. And it speaks to the attitude that he had heading into this situation. As much as he's a green light kind of scorer, and he is somebody that looks a lot for his shot, I don't think he's hoggish with it at all.
No,
like
not at all.
He's not somebody that looks for his shot at the expense of other guys clearly more open than him or in a better position. I don't think he forces shots for somebody that is clearly looking for his shots. It's rare where you watch him out there and you're like, dude, like seriously, come on now. Like that does not happen a lot with Monk, which is a credit, I think, also to the maturity that he's trying to show in this situation, because it could be very easy for him to start pressing when he feels like, dude, I got to have a baseline of production in order to get my next deal. Like, and at some point, it doesn't even matter how much, as long as the Lakers don't bench him, how happy he makes him, because he knows the likelihood of re-signing them because of cap rules are extremely low.
The Lakers could offer him, I believe, one of their exceptions for next year, but it would hard cap them. And just the mechanics of bringing Malik Monk back are really, really complicated.
So as long as he stays on the floor, and the way he's been playing right now, they need his scoring. Like he could easily play more selfish than he has, and probably get away with it. And he hasn't. It's interesting too when you said about him starting. I think he could stay in the starting lineup. I don't know for sure if he will, just because some combination I expect of Stanley Johnson, assuming he's with the team, Bradley, assuming he's with the team, and Monk. 2 of those 3 are going to get those spots. And I think you could make arguments for all 3 of them. I think Stanley Johnson needs to be in there the most, just because there's nobody else really like him on the team. And it can really help LeBron specifically with some defensive assignments. From there, between Monk or Bradley, I don't have a strong opinion about which one should get that starting role necessarily, but I think both of them should be playing. And the fact that you can even have this debate at all, I think speaks very well to 2 pretty good, Bradley's more of a surprise than Monk, but just 2 very pleasant stories for the year.
Yeah, and it's for a season that has had few of them. I think, Monk, because he really just genuinely seems like just a very nice, good guy, great teammate.
Kind of like Avery Bradley.
Guys like, but you said guys like being around and brings a positive energy to everything he's doing.
Yeah.
But it's also, you see guys take big bets and big swings on themselves. And to see it pay off, like I'm not talking about somebody's going to give Monk $35 million for 2 years. I'm not talking about that. But I do think Monk has played his way into a $7, $8, $9 million or something like that, for 3 years. And he's going to make a much better deal next year if this continues. than he had going into this year, and that was not guaranteed when it started. And knowing now what I know about the guy, it's a cool story. And it obviously benefits the Lakers whether he starts or not. Agree with you. You could make the argument for any of these guys. I do wonder, Andy, if it could become one of those things where, as much as Vogel wants a consistent lineup, that maybe one of those spots becomes a little fungible depending on who they're playing and what they might need defensively as much as anything.
Could be. Yeah.
But yeah, and so that was cool. He has shown more ability to, I think, be a more well-rounded player than I think a lot of people might have expected. And
particularly
I think
as a playmaker.
Yeah, benefited
he
more
throws
than
some
anybody.
Slick passes, man.
He does. Benefited more than anybody, I think, from the opening of roster spots, and the ability to play kind of unencumbered for a little while because there's literally nobody there to replace him. So we'll talk about him. Would love to talk a little bit more about Austin Reeves, who I tried to get to brag about himself a little bit on Monday, and he was still in aw shucks mode. But there's, I think, a little bit more confidence behind him than he's letting on, so we can talk about that. Also revealed something very interesting about his social media that made both of us sad. So we'll try to do that over the course of the week. But an important game coming up Tuesday night, right, Andy, against the Sacramento Kings.
Got to keep winning.
Got to keep winning. So we'll be with you guys after that one, and we'll see everybody on Wednesday.